Good evening. Oh. I was told to emphasize to bring food to the Major's barn. It is a potluck, so I'll go ahead and mention that one more time. I may even mention it again right before we finish. That way I can say I did my part.
What are we going to do? Games and fun?
All right. We are back in the book of 1 Kings, and we'll pick up where we had left off this past Wednesday. I think the last two verses that we actually covered in 1 Kings chapter 2 was verse 26 and verse 27. And within this section, it is the wicked leaders that Solomon is fixing to bring justice upon. And we briefly discussed Abiathar, the priest, and what Solomon had done with him, but we're going to go ahead and read those two verses again and just briefly discuss him, and then we'll move forward from there because we didn't quite get to finish discussing Abiathar and what took place with him, but we'll move forward from that point. But let's go ahead and look at 1 Kings chapter 2. We'll read verse 26 and verse 27. It says, "And to Abiathar the priest the king said, Go to Anathoth, to your own fields, for you are deserving of death, but I will not put you to death at this time, because you carried the ark of the Lord before my father David, and because you were afflicted every time my father was afflicted." So Solomon removed Abiathar from being priest to the Lord, that he might fulfill the word of the Lord which he spoke concerning the house of Eli at Shiloh. Okay, we remember who Abiathar is, correct? This is the priest that went off with Adonijah in his attempt at a rebellion. So he's one that sided with Adonijah. We're going to see Joab in verses 28 and following, also one who had sided with Adonijah. What's interesting, though, when you come into this section, it does say that you are deserving of death. Now, I was thinking about this, every time I go back and the more and more I've read through these first several chapters, it's like more and more thoughts come to my mind when I'm considering these individuals. And I got to thinking, what is it that you would really want to see in a man who is going to be king over God's people? What kind of character traits would you want to see in this man? What would he be like to be a good, godly king?
Number one, compassion.
Compassion? Okay, that's a good one. Righteous. Fair. Just, right? That's a good one. Sir? Merciful. Wise. Courageous. All these very good qualities that a leader for God should have. And the more that I read back through this rendering of justice, if you will, the more I realized that you see all of these scattered out through this section of the text. And you see Solomon exhibit these very well. Now remember, the one that he had just recently had killed was Adonijah. Now he proved himself to be wicked, and he was warned about what he was doing. He said, look, if you prove yourself to be wicked, you will be killed. Well, with Abiathar, he says, you're worthy of death, but I'm not going to kill you. So immediately we see a little bit of mercy being seen toward Abiathar, and part of that is because of his relationship that he had with David and some of the things that they had done together. And the very fact that when David was afflicted, Abiathar was also afflicted when they were on the run, essentially when Absalom had rebelled. So he says, because of these things, I'm going to spare you. And he does not kill him, but instead he says, okay, well, you're going to go back to Anathoth. Now, this would have been some of the property that was actually allotted to the Levites, and typically it was when they were no longer serving as a priest, this is where they would go. It seems somewhat like a retirement place in today's terminology, if you will. So that's where he's going. You're not going to die. I'm going to allow you to go there, and this is going to be what your life pertains now, but you are no longer going to serve as a priest before the Lord because of your rebellion. Now, this is not one that David himself specifically said, this is somebody you need to tend to in the instruction that he gave him, but Solomon sees fit that he also needs to make sure that something is done with him. But in this, there is long-suffering, there is mercy. Now remember, even also, this is something he did that would have been somewhat against Solomon, right? We're pretty certain it was known Solomon was going to be the next king. And Adonijah tries to rebel and Abiathar immediately sides up with him, it could have easily been taken somewhat personal by Solomon. But he doesn't seem to take it so personal that he says, you know what, yes, you're deserving of death and you're going to die. Rather, he shows compassion and mercy. So that's a little bit that we see in him as a leader. But now it also goes in verse 27, the latter part of that, it says that he might fulfill the word of the Lord which he spoke concerning the house of Eli at Shiloh. Now, if you go all the way back to 1 Samuel chapter 2, verses 31 through 33, you see this prophecy. And basically what it is Abiathar is actually within the family or the household of Eli, the family line of Eli. And back in that text, the warning is, your arm will be cut off. The arm of your house, your strength. This is where their strength was in the priesthood. Down the road a long ways, it is essentially fulfilled. I can't help but to think about, okay, well, that warning was given, and I mean, David reigned for 40 years. Well, this was even before David came into reign. This was before Saul even came in to be king. Yet these things are being told by a prophet pertaining this household. You know, sometimes we don't look at God's plan as we think about our plans. I mean, I don't know exactly how many years it was, but how many people probably were sitting there thinking, well, yeah, this prophecy's been said, but I don't see anything happening. Right? How many people today still say, well, God promises this or God promises that, but I don't see his coming of his son yet. It doesn't mean it's not going to happen. It just means that the time's not right for God yet. The things that God says will happen, and we see the fulfillment of this prophecy even taking place many years later with Abiathar as he is removed from serving in the priesthood, and we'll see him being replaced as we move through the text. Any questions before we move on to Joab pertaining Abiathar and what's done with him? Good? All right, so let's go to the next section. Let's look at Joab's plea for his life. Somebody, if you will, read verse 28 through 30.
Then the news came to Joab, for Joab had defected to Adonijah, though he had not defected to Absalom. So Joab fled to the tabernacle of the Lord, and took hold of the horns of the altar. And King Solomon was told, Joab has fled to the tabernacle of the Lord. There he is by the altar. Then Solomon sent Benaiah, the son of Jerrod, saying, go strike him down. Is that as far as you want me to go?
Yes, sir. Wait, verse 30.
Okay. So Benaiah went to the tabernacle of the Lord and said to him, thus says the king, come out. And he said, no, but I will die here. And Benaiah brought word back to the king, saying, thus says Joab, and thus he has answered me.
Thank you, sir. Okay, so verse 28, the beginning of verse 28, the news came to Joab, for Joab had defected to Adonijah. Now, I don't know if this is necessarily pointing to the news about Abiathar, if this is pointing to the news about Adonijah. One or the other, news has now came to Joab saying what has taken place, and we immediately see Joab run to the horns of the altar, right? Somewhat like Adonijah did. Almost pulling a page right out of his book. He's crying out for mercy. Please save me, save me. Now, what was the meaning behind going and taking hold of the horns of the altar? Asking for mercy. Do you remember, as far as the law goes, what that law specifically implied, who that was for?
It was for someone who had killed accidentally.
Accidental, right? It was specific for that. And in that case, they could get righteous judgment. They could get a just trial, in a sense, if you will, to make sure that they received or did not receive any punishment if it was an accidental killing. I think the illustration that's used back in the law was if a man is using an axe and the axe head comes off and it strikes his friend or brother and kills him, you know, this is accidental and he can run, he can take hold of the horns of the altar, and he will receive, you know, righteous judgment over this. Now, Joab, maybe he saw, maybe he heard what Adonijah had done. Remember, that's exactly what he did. He took off and he got a hold of the horns of the altar and he was begging for mercy. Was what Joab did in any means an accident pertaining to the men he killed? it's kind of silly for him to run and to take hold of the horns of the altar, but I think it's like a last chance, like, please spare me. I mean, he knows what he did, and he knows what he did was murder. It wasn't accidental. Yet he's going to run and he's going to take hold of the horns of the altar, and he's going to hope that somebody's going to extend some sort of mercy toward him. So, Solomon tells, got my names confused. Joab tells Benaiah to go and basically to take care of this problem. And he reasons and he says, look, he reasons in the text says he defected to Adonijah, though he did not defect to Absalom. Well, he flees to the tabernacle of the Lord. He took hold of the horns of the altar. In verse 29, King Solomon was told this, and Joab fled to the tabernacle of the Lord. There he is by the altar. Then Solomon sends Benaiah, the son of Jehoiada, saying, go strike him down. So he's going to do exactly that, but it's kind of interesting when he gets there. He says, I will not come out. Basically he's saying, no, I will die here. That's Joab. You know, Benaiah comes in and he's like, okay, well, come on out of there. He said, no, I'll die here. You ever hear somebody say, okay, like you hear the saying, you'll have to pry it from my cold, dead hands, right? Or over my dead body, that kind of language. Be careful what you say. Well, Solomon's going to respond in this when we'll see in this next section of text. You're going to get exactly what you asked for. You want to die there? Well, you're fixing to die there, essentially. Somebody go ahead and read verse 31 and 32 for us.
Then the king said to him, do as he has said, and strike him down and bury him. But you may take away from me and from the house of my father the innocent blood which Joab shed. For the Lord will return his blood on his head, because he struck down 2 men more righteous and better than he, and killed them with the sword, Abner the son of Ner, and the commander of the army of Israel, and Amasa the son of Jether, the commander of the army of Judah. Though my father David did not know it.
Thank you, sir. So I'm not sure exactly why Benaiah would have went and actually said, hey, come out of there. And when Joab says, no, I'll die here, he was already told to strike him. And we see that throughout a lot of 2 Samuel. We'll see it through the Kings, and that language is go and kill him. Now, for whatever reason, maybe it's the location, he's like, okay, well, let me double check and make sure this is what he wants. So he goes back and he talks with the king, and the king says, no, do just as he has said, and you strike him right there. And he goes in, and ultimately he does. He strikes him dead there. But, again, going back to the character of Solomon, he did say strike him, but what else did he say to do with him? Bury him. Now, if you think going back to Joab and the men that are listed, these that are more righteous than he, that he killed, did he show them any kind of respect whatsoever? As a matter of fact, he left one laying in the street with his entrails coming out. And he didn't have any care, any concern to do anything with him but leave him right there, showing no respect whatsoever. Yet Solomon is going to show some sort of respect and at least saying, okay, well, justice needs to be served here, but we're going to go about this right and at least take him back to his own place and bury him. Now, it also says within the text, it says the Lord will return his blood on his own head. It seems like that, yes, Joab was responsible for his own actions, but being he was serving as a commander, and he would have served under David, in some sense it seems like David felt that part of that guilt was on the kingdom. Part of that guilt was on him. And I guess Solomon would have been under the same kind of line of thinking, and he says, look, okay, when we execute justice as it should be, then that blood will be on his own head. What would be the punishment for murder?
Murder.
Well, he's going to die, right? So they're just in their actions. And we ask a lot of questions coming into this as far as David and why he would choose to push this to Solomon. And we come up with a lot of reasons, I think, that might be suitable. And I think we'll really see as we get to the close of this chapter a lot more of what was going on and why some of the things played out how they played out. But the latter part of that verse, verse 32, where it says, though my father David did not know it. Basically just meaning he did not order this to happen. This was not something that David gave charge for. This is something that Joab went and he did this on his own, and he killed these men, and he did it ruthlessly, and he left their bodies laying, one of them even in the street. And what he's saying is, my father didn't know about that. He didn't know this was going to happen. Yes, he knew about the murders because David's the one that said he killed this man, he killed this man. Make sure that his hair does not go down to the grave without bloodshed, right? He knew it took place, but he did not actually call it to happen. So now justice is actually being served for Joab, and I think it's completely righteous. I think it's completely within what was to take place as far as the law pertained. So he tells him, go ahead and strike him, but be sure and take and be sure and bury him. All right, verse 33 through verse 35, if somebody will please read that.
The blood shall therefore return upon the head of Joab and upon the head of his descendants forever, but upon David and his descendants, upon his house and his throne, there shall be peace forever from the Lord. So Benaiah the son of Jehoiada went up and struck and killed him, and he was buried until in his own house in the wilderness. The king put Benaiah the son of Jehoiada in his place over the army, and the king put Zadok the priest in the place of Abiathar.
Thank you, sir. There at the beginning of verse 33 is kind of restating what we've just discussed and kind of what was said in the previous verse. Their blood shall therefore return upon the head of Joab and upon the head of his descendants forever. Our hands are going to be clean in this matter. Now, I think thinking through it, it seems like David would have been under the belief, and Solomon also, that if justice was not served here, that they would have felt guilty in this matter in some sense. Something had to take place. And I think that's part of why David was saying, look, I need you to make sure justice is executed as it pertains to Joab. It can't go unchecked. I think we'll discuss more about kind of the reasoning as far as why he passed it off as we get to the end of the chapter. But it says, upon David and his descendants, upon his house and his throne, there shall be peace forever from the Lord. So Benaiah the son of Jehoiada went up and struck him and killed him. He did exactly what Solomon asked, but then he shows the respect, verse 34, and he was buried in his own house and in the wilderness. So now you have both of these men who had originally rebelled against David in trying to side up with Adonijah. Both of them are now removed. One is sent to this land where he's going to just stay there. The other has been killed. And now in verse 35, we see officially Benaiah being put in place as the commander of the army, and Zadok being put in place as the priest. So these are the two men that are now leading in these positions. They've been, I guess you'd say, publicly or even legitimately placed in this position of leadership. Any questions or thought before we go to Shimei? Good? All right. Let's go on to verses 36 through 38. Now, remember who Shimei was, right? Anybody remember who he was? Remember the one that was cursing David?
Yeah, in the street.
Right? Throwing stones at him and all these things, and David's...
Way through, but then not on the way back.
Right. Yeah, in one direction he was cursing him. He was throwing stones at him and saying that all the blood from the house of Saul was on his head. And right. But then in David's return back to Jerusalem after Absalom's rebellion, then he recognizes his fault, and he says, oh man, please forgive me. Please don't hold this against me. Show me mercy, right? Well, David in that instance, he did show mercy, and he says, you will not die. But at the latter part of his life, he tells Solomon, I need you to make sure that you use your wisdom in what happens with Shimei. And this is kind of interesting, the way he goes about this, because David had already told him, you're not going to die for what you've already done, the wickedness that you have done toward David, but use your judgment in what should take place. And David actually said, don't allow his hair to go down to the grave without bloodshed just the same. So he wanted him ultimately to wind up dying, but here's how he goes about it. Verse 37 6. Let's read verse 36 through 38, if somebody will, please.
Then the king sent and called for Shimei and said to him, Build yourself a house in Jerusalem and dwell there, and do not go out from there anywhere. For it shall be on the day you go out and cross the brook Kidron, know for certain you shall surely die. Your blood shall be on your own head. And Shimei said to the king, The saying is good, as my lord the king has said, so your servant will do. So Shimei dwelt in Jerusalem many days.
Okay, so, thanks, sir. Basically what Solomon's idea is here, I'm going to confine you to Jerusalem. House arrest. Now, it doesn't seem like all that big of a deal, but you know how big Jerusalem was at that time? Not very big. Some people said about 11 square miles would have been the entirety of Jerusalem. I don't know if that's exact, but it's not very big. Well, he says, you're going to stay here. This is what I'm requesting of you, or this is what I am telling you. You're not to go out from here. You're not to go anywhere else. And if you do, you're going to be killed. That's going to be your punishment. Now, what is unique about him telling Shimei that he cannot leave Jerusalem? What is unique about him making him stay in Jerusalem? What else do we know about Shimei that might cause problems? Remember who he was, whose family he was of?
Saul.
Family of Saul, right? He was of the family of Saul. So now if you bind him to staying there at Jerusalem, what does that ultimately stop from happening? He can't go back to where he was from. He can't go back and try and build up his own rebellion. Possibility. He was of Saul's family. And remember, that's one of the claims he made against David. Look, the blood of all the household of Saul is on your head. Well, if he wanted to go and try and start a rebellion of his own, then he would have had to go back to his own land. And maybe that's why Solomon says, okay, here's what's going to happen. You're going to stay right here and you can't go anywhere. And if you do, you're going to die.
Wasn't he a Benjaminite?
Yes.
So he was out of his territory of land. He couldn't actually own any land in Jerusalem. It was in Judah. So he had to go back on the other side of Jordan. Yeah,
Right.
He'd be completely at the whim of others.
Right. I mean, it's a pretty tough spot for him to be in, but at the same time, exactly. He knows that he was very much, he received very much mercy from David in not being killed then. And now Solomon says, here's what I want you to do. You stay here, you'll live, but if you leave, you're going to die. And what did he even respond to that? So this is good. Sounds good to me. I'll abide by that. No problem. Sounds great. Let's look at verse 39 through 41. Somebody read that, please.
Now it happened at the end of 3 years that 2 slaves of Shimei ran away to Achish, the son of Micaiah, king of Gath. And they told Shimei, saying, Look, your slaves are in Gath. So Shimei rose, saddled his donkey, and went to Achish at Gath to seek his slaves. And Shimei went down and brought his slaves from Gath. 41.
Yes, sir, through 41.
Solomon was told that Shimei had gone from Jerusalem to Gath and had come back.
You know, sometimes when we first hear something, it has a little bit more pop originally. It has a little bit more meaning. You know, the day that he told him you were not to leave, it meant a lot to him. 3 years later, I guess it didn't quite have the same ring to it. And his slaves leave, and he's like, man, I got to go get these guys. So he does. Doesn't act like he really hesitated much at all, but immediately he went to go get his slaves. And he did exactly what he said he would not do. Well, we have to expect justice is going to be served, right? Mm-hmm.
Do you think, though, there's an indicator here in what his real heart and attitude was? Because it's been 3 years since he arose and saddled his donkeys.
Mm-hmm.
He was under house arrest. Why didn't he sell his donkeys 3 years earlier?
It's a good question.
Unless he intended to use them.
Right, that's a good question. If you couldn't hear, Chris was asking, you know, this has been 3 years, and kind of just to show where his heart was. If he was bound to Jerusalem, this small area, why in the world did he keep his donkeys? Why didn't he sell them a long time ago? Was it ever, maybe, I guess, a thought in his mind, maybe one day I will go? Maybe I don't want to get rid of these yet because I need some transportation later, possibly. Whatever it is, he decided at this point, okay, well, it's been long enough. I don't know if he thought maybe Solomon just wouldn't go through with what he said he would after this long a time, but the text says different. Let's look at verse 42 and through 44. If somebody will read that, please.
Then the king sent and called for Shimei and said to him, Did I not make you swear by the Lord and warn you, saying, Know for certain that on the day you go out and travel anywhere you shall surely die? And you said to me, The word I have heard is good. Why then have you not kept the oath of the Lord and the commandment that I gave you? The king said moreover to Shimei, You know, as your heart acknowledges, all the wickedness that you did to my father David. Therefore the Lord will return your wickedness on your own head.
Thank you, sir. I mean, it's pretty cut and dry. You knew exactly what you were not supposed to do, and you went ahead and did it. And he says, Did I not make you swear to this before? What were you thinking? He still winds up going. Basically, the king goes ahead and he fulfills what was said originally, and he's going to die because of his wickedness. He does say there at the end in verse 44 that you know as your heart acknowledges all the wickedness that you did to my father David, therefore the Lord will return the wickedness on your own head. He said, look, you know you were deserving of death at that time. You know what you did even to my father David was wrong, but luckily you were spared. You were shown mercy then. You were shown mercy when I gave you this ability just to stay in Jerusalem, but you went against that command, and now you're deserving of death. And now it's fulfilled what David asked him to do pertaining all of those who he asked him to make sure justice is executed. Yes, ma'am.
A reference I have, Exodus 22:28, you shall not curse God nor curse the ruler of the people. And that's what Shimei did.
That's exactly what he did. You know, I think in that instance, we discussed it a little bit as far as why David would just, spare him at that moment, because even David's own men were like, do you want us to strike him down right here? They were expecting they would have killed him. But David, in his mind at that time, and the wrong that he had done, it's like he almost felt that he was deserving of some sort of punishment, it seemed like, and he was willing to accept that. And basically David said, look, if the Lord has told this man to curse me, then, so be it, let it be. And he didn't kill him at that time. But thank you for the reference to Exodus. Now at this point, he's gotten what he has deserved. And I guess that kind of ties back even your verse reference to what is said in the last part of verse 44. You know what you did before, the wickedness you did and what you were deserving of then. So justice is handled in that situation. And that is the end of all three that David had originally told him, I need you to take care of these individuals. Plus you have Abiathar thrown in there who he also felt something needed to happen with him too. But let's go ahead and look at the last two verses before we get into chapter 3. If somebody will read verse 45 and 46, please.
The King Solomon shall be blessed, and the throne of David shall be established before the Lord forever. So the king commanded Benaiah the son of Jehoiada, and he went out and struck him down, and he died. Thus the kingdom was established in the hand of Solomon.
The last verse there, I think, answers some of the questions we had asked early on. Even the verse 45, King Solomon shall be blessed, and the throne of David shall be established before the Lord forever. We kind of asked, okay, why was it that David passed off even the responsibility of taking care of Joab? Why did he pass it off Solomon? He was within the right, and Joab was in the wrong. He could have done it himself. I think verse 46 in that very last sentence explains a lot. It says, thus the kingdom was established in the hand of Solomon. I think it was Jesse Lee that actually had mentioned in our last setting, could it have been that part of this and everything that David had asked Solomon to do would have been in some form him getting to establish the kingdom at his own hand? And right here at the end of the chapter, it shows that. Everything that he did is now established a kingdom in his own hand. He's been able to make it solid. And remember, it was passed off to him just the same way. David had it firmly established besides these few loose ends that needed to be taken care of. And now they're all taken care of. Yes, sir.
It's kind of like you got to cut your teeth on something, you know. He had to, if David would have taken care of it, Solomon stepped in and everything's all rosy, well, that didn't prove that he deserved to have that. So he steps in, squashes the remainder of the rebellion that was against his father and him.
Mm-hmm.
You know, these guys rebelled against him as well.
Yeah.
And so by squashing that, he's saying, I am the king.
Right.
I'm going to establish the people that I want in these positions.
Mm-hmm.
And the reign of these people is over.
Yeah.
It's done. And established his own reign. And now he can go on to mess it all up pretty good like that. Not for a minute.
Yeah, he will do that. I definitely think that's a big part of it. It was part of David's thought process, I think, that this would help Solomon establish it by his own hand. And even in Solomon actually putting Benaiah and Solomon putting Zadok in as commander and as priest, that was something that he did, not something that David did. And the people would see these things, and even the justice that was executed on each one of these men, plus the favor that was shown to the one household that showed favor to David, all these things were helping, in a political sense, Solomon build his standing with the people and with the kingdom, showing him to be the rightful leader. Yes, sir.
I was going to say, it showed his ability to handle
Mm-hmm.
these types of situations, and that he was in control of the kingdom.
Right. Well, you know, even as asked at the very beginning, what kind of traits might a leader for God's people need to have? You think about all the ones we've seen just through these interactions. Justness, mercy, or justice even, mercy, the ability to put even possible emotions aside to the people that wronged him, that rebelled directly against him, and execute judgment wisely. All these things are seen here in the last section of chapter 2 in showing that Solomon has established the kingdom. Man, that gets here quick. All right.
You've actually gotten really far today.
That's not bad. We got pretty far. Yeah. The next section that we're going to get into, and we'll go ahead and we'll probably read just a little bit of this so it can go ahead and be on your minds as we get ready to come back next week. But this is the section where I have on my slide here, wisdom and understanding. This is going to cover from chapter 3 and verse 1 all the way through chapter 4 and verse 34. And then we'll break this down into more sections as we go, with the first one being a humble request, and that is verses 1 through 15. But I do have it listed as humble request because that's one of the things we often recognize when we go into this first section. Solomon humbly asking the Lord for wisdom and how to lead over his people, but there's also some foolishness lying under the surface that we're going to look at. So yes, it's a humble request, but there's some foolish mistakes right here in the very beginning of the text. But the major emphasis as we move into the section is going to be on Solomon's God-given wisdom. And you're going to see that on display in how he handles situations and how he handles even his people as it pertains to the administration and all kinds of other things. We'll see that displayed greatly. But let's go ahead real quickly, and I'll read verses 1 through 4. That way it'll be in our minds, and then we'll get ready to come back and discuss it next time. Chapter 3, verse 1, it says, Now Solomon made a treaty with Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and married Pharaoh's daughter. Then he brought her to the city of David until he had finished building his own house and the house of the Lord and the wall all around Jerusalem. Meanwhile, the people sacrificed at the high places because there was no house built for the name of the Lord until those days. And Solomon loved the Lord, walking in the statutes of his father David, except that he sacrificed and he burned incense at the high places. Actually, I'll stop there. Do we see any problems?
Yeah.
What are some of the problems we already see?
Well, he married outside of the 12 tribes, for one.
Right? That was one of the laws, and we'll look at that. We don't have time today. We'll look at some of the stuff in Deuteronomy pertaining to these laws. What else? That's one of the things we see. High places. What do typically the high places represent?
Idols to worship to false gods.
Idolatry and false gods. When we come back next week, this was actually a more challenging spot in the text than what I originally assumed. And I had one of those moments this afternoon, like I was just briefly reading back through the text. I already had my notes. I'm like, well, I want to refresh my mind in the text, and I got to one word or one sentence in here, and it threw me for a loop. And I'm like, okay, wait a minute. Wait, what was the true fault that follows the except in verse 3? Well, we'll look at the high places and some other references as it pertains to the high places, but were the high places always these references to this idolatry? Was it always?
Not always, but for the most part.
For the most part? We'll see as we go through. I don't want to quite jump into it. Well, we have 2 minutes. We'll wait, because that's going to take a little bit of time to discuss that. But it was just when I went through this thinking about the high places, and I looked at that in verse 3 where it says, Solomon loved the Lord, walking in the statutes of his father David, except. So we know there's something here that's off. It's amiss. And it points to this worship in the high places. Well, we'll look in 2 Chronicles next week where it discusses this specific location, and it looks like this is a reasonable place for them to be worshiping. So we have to ask, okay, well, what in that specific sentence is the wrong? Is it that Solomon was doing this sacrificing? Is that what it was saying? Or was there a different place that they were supposed to be doing it altogether? So just a few things to be thinking about for next week. Also, kind of look and see what else you can find in that text of places where Solomon was missing the mark, if you will. Appreciate your attention. We'll stop there and pick back up next week.